We have to talk about Justinian.
Yes.
One of the most impactful Roman emperors in history, started as a peasant and rose in power to become emperor. He fought wars of conquest and was very consequential and impactful.
Yes.
So who was he?
All right. So Justinian was the emperor from 527 to 565. So quite a long reign. He was the nephew of the previous emperor, Justin I, who was an older man, ruled for just under a decade before Justinian. And both of them came from small, poor agricultural communities in the Western Balkans.
We should say that Justin I ended up in your worst 10 emperors list.
Yeah, for one decision, he's not the worst of the worst, but he made a very, very bad call when it came to church policy, tore the church apart. You shouldn't have done that, in my view. But by the way, Justinian is an immensely complicated figure. I found it impossible to decide, first of all, whether to put him on the best emperors or the worst emperors.
Yeah, you're being spicy.
Yeah. You have to be provocative about these things.
Yes.
And I thought omitting those two would be that, and it was. So, and here we are talking about it.
Yeah, exactly. The controversy.
Yes.
Yep.
And through all the systems of social mobility that we've been talking about, Justin ended up emperor. Because of his military background, he just rose through the ranks. He was in the right place, the right time, became emperor. And then he gradually positioned his nephew, Justinian, whose background we do not know. Literally, we do not know anything that Justinian did before the age of something like 38 when he appears on the historical record. Same background. We know where he came from, but we don't know what he was doing. Although, was he an active soldier for decades? We don't know. Probably not. He comes equipped with a knowledge of something like Roman law and some Christian theology. That seems to be what he knew. And then Justin positions him to become his successor eventually, kind of reluctantly, but he does. Justinian also marries Theodora, who's a woman who's a former sex worker, which is a controversial choice. By this point, he's a senator and is holding all of these top generalships. And then he becomes emperor.
She was also very influential. Yes.
Very powerful. Yes.
Very powerful.
During his reign. So the interesting thing about Justinian's choice of, let's say, associates, and that includes his wife, is that he seems to have just gone for people he thought were talented or that would be good for him as a ruler, rather than their social class or prestige. And so he accumulates around him quite a motley group of odd, sometimes these kinds of disreputable people. But they did what he wanted them to, and they with lasting consequences for world history. So he has an eye for talent, and he doesn't hesitate to pick people that others might look down on if he thought they could get the job done. And these are some of the attributes that enable him to be as successful as he was. So that's his background. He's a Latin speaker primarily, but he knows Greek too.
So here he is, but he had, like I mentioned, the wars of conquest. He also overhauled the Roman law.
He appoints a committee.
Yep.
As one does, to just take the whole of Roman law and condense it into what today we call the Corpus Juris Civilis, which is the body of Roman civil law. And this was a massive work of codification, and it is our main source for Roman law. Overwhelmingly, what we call Roman law is what Justinian's committee, and specifically this character called Tribonian, who was a very accomplished jurist, said it was.
And did that persist through time? Did that last?
Yes, still to this day. When you study Roman law, you're studying Tribonian's committee.
And so, in terms of our modern society, how much of impact did that have? This codification, this stable law that ran the East Roman Empire?
Well, I mean, Roman legal concepts pervade everything from philosophy to political thought to actual Roman legal practice. I mean, it depends on what country you're in. So in many of the countries of Europe, it is the current law, and to some degree. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but legal scholars have to study Roman law. Even law students have to do that. Not in so much in countries like the United States or Britain, which have the so-called common law system, but ideas in Roman law about, for example, property right? Ownership, things like this. These were hugely important in formulating ideas, for example, about sovereignty in political thought. Yeah, it's one of the most important and influential acts of committee work ever done in Constantinople.
So going to Perplexity here and looking at some aspects of the Justinian's laws, they include a systematic structure of private law, persons, things, actions, strong protection of property and contracts, detailed family and inheritance rules, and a hierarchical status-based view of persons. These elements became the template for later civil law systems. And some overall structures, tripartite schema, law organized around personae, legal subjects, things, and procedural actions. Essentially, who, what, and how of private law. And it goes on. I mean, a lot of things I'm reading here really sounds like what we think of as law.
Yeah.
Marriage.
Look, most of it's about property.
Yeah. Marriage is a legal status. Lawful matrimony required conformity to rules about age, citizenship, and connubium or prohibited degrees, incest rules, adoption relations, etc. All that kind of stuff.
Oh, yes. Who you can marry, who not.
What was their view of homosexuality?
Well, I mean, Justinian thought it caused earthquakes.
Oh, did it?
Yes.
Did it?
Yes.
Wow. That's fascinating.
No, for him, for Christian emperors or Christian authorities, this is a reprehensible, immoral act. Depending, it could be punished. Mm-hmm. Justinian did try to punish it pretty brutally. I mean, ultimately, lethally. However, this gets really tricky here because what counts as a homosexual act is not clear to everybody, right? And in addition to which, this is a society that generally will not go after, let's say, scandals or deviants or however you want to call it, like systematically. This is not like there's no inquisition. Mm-hmm. There's no social police. If there's some sort of scandal and this comes out, then it's a problem. But they're not actively going to track down, hunt down, monitor, survey, interrogate people about their sex lives. I mean, it is in a way, despite having views that we may not agree with about sexuality, it was generally humane in the way of just kind of leaving people alone.
I mean, that said, there's some, I'm just on Perplexity, looked up Justinian Roman law view of sexuality. They're pretty harsh on like adultery and just getting freaky with it.
No, Justinian was more zealous in this matter, definitely.
Even though he married a sex worker.
Well, sex work wasn't illegal.
Right, but it's a bit spicy.
Yes, and in fact, it was illegal for a senator to marry someone from such a disreputable profession, and he got his uncle to pass a law changing that rule so that he could.
Well,
yeah,
love knows no bounds.
Actually, Justinian kind of says that in one of his laws.
Oh, well.
No, he clearly loved her. There's no question.
Actual love. I mean, you'll have to like this guy. Started as a peasant, surrounded himself by all kinds of weirdos just because they were good at what they did, and it doesn't really matter class or not.
Yes, but there's a lot to be said against him too. I like so much.
Let's get into it. So he did launch wars of conquest. What was his view of war and conquest, and what maybe what are the things we should mention in terms of expansionary wars?
He thought he was authorized by God to reconquer the lost provinces of the Western Roman Empire. And when he did so, that was proof that God favored him. And he was generally opportunistic about it, and for the most part kind of successful, in that he intervened in the most critical moments of the histories of these barbarian, kingdoms in the West, and exploited their weaknesses and took them over. Now, in the process, many of these provinces were ravaged by war. Italy for decades. he overstretched his resources, leaving his successors with a much more dangerous situation to defend. And he disbanded certain armies that were meant to protect Constantinople, sent them to Italy, for example. This weakened the home front. So he left a very difficult legacy for his successors in that way. Plus, some of the provinces that he conquered were so, like Italy, I don't think it could even pay for itself after a certain point. So I'm not sure that some of those decisions were the best ones. North Africa, yeah, probably that paid off. Italy and southern Spain, not so sure.
So that's one of the big criticisms is even though there was conquest, it was overextended and those lands were not economically stable.
Yeah, and
broke.
Yeah.
AKA.
Conquest is not just good, in itself. I mean, I know that some rulers in history are called the Great simply because they conquered something, but that's not enough. I mean, I know that rulers do this, but if we're to compare them to each other, we should at least expect that they have a plan or that it works out well in the end, let's say. And I don't think that many of these did.
I should say that as far as historians go, I think you don't give too many points on the conquest front.
Personally, I don't. No.
Yeah, so your value comes from, is a leader implementing lasting change, like a stable...
Was he good for his subjects?
Yeah.
Were they living better because of him than otherwise?
And also like the long-term nature of it, not just like a temporary thing.
Right. Are you strengthening institutions that benefit your subjects? That. And some he did, some not. So look, in order to send those armies west to make those conquests, he stripped the east of armies. So the Persians could just march in and like destroyed Antioch. Like that's a major strategic failure. And I don't think you get a pass for conquering North Africa by surrendering Syria.
He did rebuild Constantinople and reconstructed the Hagia Sophia.
Yes, after he and his soldiers set fire to it. Yes, in the Nika insurrection. So this is when the people of the capital rise up against him, and there's like about 10 days of street fighting, and he brings in some armies, and eventually he orders his armies to slaughter the protesters, leaving more than 30,000 dead. Like this is an enormous number. And a lot of Constantinople burned in the process, and he rebuilt it. So his building is considered one of his great points. He built Hagia Sophia, for example, which is a magnificent church, like hands down. It's just a fascinating monument to study too. And that was him too. I'm trying to give you a sense here that the good and the bad are mixed in such equal measure that, like Buridan's ass, I can't decide which bale of hay to put him on.
But there's a grand scale to the good and the bad.
Yes.
For many people, that's what makes for a top 10 emperor list. What about the plague?
Well, he wasn't responsible for that, at least.
Right. Okay. The plague of Justinian, aka 541 AD. So some historians claim that it killed half the population and ruined the empire. You are skeptical on this view.
Yes. So this is a bubonic plague, which lasts more or less for 2 centuries. It comes and it goes, and it's kind of endemic to large parts of the world. 541 is when it starts to break out in the empire, in Constantinople and other cities, and it spreads. There's been a lot of debate about this recently, because now we've actually isolated the pathogen. It's Yersinia pestis, like we know this. Just like a generation ago, this was just guesswork. But now there's all of this new like laboratory science work that's come in to fill in some of the gaps in history.
That's so cool.
It is. There are lots of discussions about that. And so the study of diseases and virology have just become much more important lately. It still doesn't tell you, however, like mortality rates and historical impact. Like for that, you still need standard old-fashioned non-laboratory historical work. And there's a debate about the impact of this plague, and it's ongoing, I should say that. And some scholars argue for a kind of maximalist position of 50%. I think that would have brought this society to a halt, just logistically speaking. And so I believe in a much more moderate impact.
And the real impact is what? The tax base shrinks?
Oh yeah. The tax base would shrink instantly. You wouldn't be able to recruit armies. There would be massive social dislocation. Like what happens in the Black Death in Europe in the 14th century. Like we have very good records for what happened to those societies, and basically everything that they were doing stopped for a few years until they sort of tried to put things back together again. This does not happen in the 6th century. In fact, Justinian is at that time waging war on something like 4 or 5 different fronts. If you read the narratives of those wars, there's no pause. There's no impact from the plague on the conduct of those wars. They just continue on.
Mm-hmm.
Taxation continues. The courts continue. Like you just don't see it in the narrative. And so I think that there's a much less impact than certainly than 50%. Yeah.
So this sets the stage for tumultuous 7th century.
Yeah, you could call it that. Yes.
So what is the legacy of Justinian in terms of how he left the empire leading into the 7th century?
Well, he left it overextended. So his successors had to deal with many more problems along many more fronts, with fewer military forces concentrated in what we might call the homeland of the Eastern Roman Empire. And so that made the center vulnerable too. And so you start to get raids into the Balkans, and it enters a kind of vicious cycle again. Now, not all of this was Justinian's fault. I mean, the plague definitely had some impact, but I wouldn't blame everything on his successors, as is sometimes done. Like they mishandled the situation. He left them a very difficult situation to deal with.